They were told they weren't ready. They were told they weren't smart enough. They were told that mechanized warfare required a kind of courage and intelligence that men who looked like them simply didn't possess. For 2 years, they trained in the Texas heat while the war raged on without them. And then, in October 1944, when Patton's armored divisions were bleeding out in France and winter was closing in, the call finally came. The 761st Tank Battalion, the Black Panthers, were going to war. They would face the deadliest army in history. They would break through impenetrable defenses. They would prove that courage doesn't have a color. This is their story. October 1944. In a smoke-filled command room somewhere in France, General George S. Patton was staring at a map that was bleeding red. His armored columns were grinding to a halt. His tanks were burning faster than they could be replaced. The German defensive line was hardening into steel, and winter was coming. On paper, there was a solution. One fresh battalion of tanks sat ready in the American reserves, fully trained, fully equipped, combat ready. But they had never fired a shot in anger. The problem wasn't their training. It wasn't their equipment. It wasn't even their readiness. The problem was that every single man in that battalion was black. In a nation still divided by the color line, these soldiers had already been judged. Some in Washington feared what would happen if they failed in combat. But others feared something far more dangerous. What would happen if they succeeded? You see, the United States Army in 1944 operated under a lie that had been repeated so many times it had calcified into policy. That black men lacked the temperament for mechanized warfare, that they couldn't handle the complexities of armored combat, that they belonged in supply depots and labor battalions, not in the turret of a 30-ton Sherman tank facing down the Wehrmacht. But Patton was running out of options. He needed armor. He needed it now, and he needed it to be absolutely ruthless. So he made a decision that would ripple through history. Not just military history, American history. But here's what makes this decision so explosive. Patton wasn't just afraid these men might fail. He was afraid they might be too good. Because if black soldiers proved themselves to be among the most brutally effective fighters in the European theater, then every lie America had told itself about them would shatter. And the country would never be able to put those pieces back together the same way again. This is the story of the 761st Tank Battalion, the men who would become known as the Black Panthers. They would tear through German defenses, rescue surrounded airborne units, smash through Hitler's Siegfried Line, and help liberate Nazi concentration camps. They would become one of the most feared armored units in Europe. But before they could fight the Third Reich, they first had to fight the expectations of their own country. Before we continue, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And thank you for joining me on this journey into history. Now, let's begin. To understand the ruthless precision the Black Panthers would bring to the battlefields of Europe, you have to understand where they were forged. Not in the forests of France or the frozen fields of Belgium, but in the scorching heat and suffocating prejudice of Camp Hood, Texas. For 2 long years, the men of the 761st trained. While white tank battalions were rushed through basic instruction and shipped overseas in a matter of months, the Black Panthers were held back. They ran the same drills until muscle memory replaced conscious thought. They studied their Shermans until they could field strip a transmission in the dark. They practiced maneuvers until they moved like a single organism. They didn't just learn to operate tanks. They learned to become tanks. But their real war didn't begin against panzer divisions. It began at a bus stop just outside the base. And what they faced there was, in some ways, harder to fight than any enemy army. Camp Hood, Texas, 1942 to 1944. Dust rising from tank treads, the roar of diesel engines, drill sergeants shouting commands over the metallic clank of machinery. This is where the 761st Tank Battalion was born. An all-black armored unit in an army that didn't quite know what to do with them. The facilities told you everything you needed to know. Separate barracks, separate mess halls, separate entrances to buildings they shared with white soldiers. Men who wore the same uniform, who saluted the same flag, who would be asked to face the same enemy, treated as fundamentally unequal before they ever left American soil. They were called names. They were told to their faces they didn't belong. They were barred from spaces their white counterparts entered freely. And through it all, they had to maintain discipline, salute officers who didn't respect them, and somehow stay focused on becoming tankers. While white armored units trained for a few months and shipped out to Europe, the 761st stayed, and stayed, and trained. For nearly 2 years, they ran the same drills, practiced the same maneuvers, studied the same tactical problems, over and over and over. Every action was scrutinized. Every mistake was magnified. The message was clear. If one of you fails, it won't just reflect on you. It will be used as proof that all black soldiers are unfit for combat. The weight of that was crushing. They weren't just training for themselves. They were training for every black man who might come after them, for families back home who were watching, for a future they could barely imagine but desperately wanted to be part of. Their officers, aware of the microscope they were all under, pushed them harder than any comparable unit. Perfection became the only acceptable standard, because competence wouldn't be enough. They had to be undeniable. And then there were the moments that crystallized everything. A German prisoner of war, a man who had sworn allegiance to Hitler, allowed to sit inside a Texas diner and order a meal, while the black American soldier guarding him had to wait outside and eat through the back door. The men of the 761st absorbed these humiliations. They swallowed the rage, and they poured it into their machines. Inside those tanks, they were judged on skill, on speed, on accuracy, and they made sure that when judgment came, there would be no room for doubt. By late 1944, they weren't just ready. They were over-prepared, overtrained, and burning with frustration. They were a coiled spring, held down not by fear of the enemy, but by the hesitation of their own country. Then the rumors started, whispers moving through the barracks. Patton had requested them. The name began to circulate, sharp, powerful, impossible to ignore. The Black Panthers. They were finally going to war. October 1944. The 761st Tank Battalion stepped off transport ships onto French soil under gray skies and cold drizzle. Mud everywhere. The distant rumble of artillery rolled across the horizon like an approaching storm. Every man in the battalion felt it. The weight of everything they'd endured, every insult swallowed, every extra drill run, every humiliation absorbed. All of it had been leading to this moment. The reception was mixed. Some white soldiers looked at them with open skepticism, muttering jokes or shaking their heads as if watching a doomed experiment. Others watched with curiosity, wondering if the rumors about their training were true. Officers studied them carefully, aware that the 761st carried a spotlight that no other battalion had to bear. Then Patton arrived. You couldn't miss him. The polished helmet, the riding jacket, the twin revolvers. He moved with the kind of authority that made everyone straighten up whether they wanted to or not. He climbed onto a half-track where the entire battalion could see him, and the chatter died. His voice was higher-pitched than you'd expect from his reputation, but it cut through the damp air like a blade. "Men," he began, "you're the first Negro tankers to ever fight in the American Army. I would never have asked for you if you weren't good. I have nothing but the best in my army." He paused, scanning the faces in front of him. "I don't care what color you are, as long as you go up there and kill those Germans. Everyone has their eyes on you and is expecting great things. Most of all, your race is looking forward to your success. Don't let them down, and damn you, don't let me down." It wasn't gentle. It wasn't comforting. But for once, a powerful white general was speaking to them as warriors. Not as laborers, not as an afterthought, as soldiers whose job was to destroy the enemy. The men understood what he'd left unsaid. If they failed, it would be used as evidence against every black soldier who came after them. But if they succeeded, if they proved undeniable, the ceiling might finally crack. Engines roared to life. Tank columns began forming in the mud, exhaust mixing with the mist. Men checked ammunition, adjusted headsets, tightened helmet straps. Some shared cigarettes. Others sat in silence, alone with their thoughts, fear and resolve mixing together like oil and water. As the Black Panthers rolled toward Lorraine and the sound of distant gunfire grew louder, none of them knew what the next hours would bring. They had trained for years for this single moment. What none of them knew, as the first shells began to fall in the distance, was that their very first battle would decide not just their future, but their place in history. Lorraine, France. November 1944. The landscape was a nightmare of freezing mud, fog-choked valleys, and hedgerows concealing enemy guns. German forces had dug in deep, confident in their anti-tank weapons and the superiority of their heavier armor. They expected the Americans to break against their defenses. They didn't expect the Black Panthers. The first enemy shell was a shriek that turned into thunder. A Sherman to the left erupted in flame. This wasn't training anymore. This was real. Metal tearing through metal. Men screaming over the radio. The acrid smell of burning fuel mixing with cordite inside the cramped turret. Inside one tank, a gunner's hands shook as he tracked movement through his periscope. The driver fought the controls as the Sherman lurched through mud that tried to swallow the treads. The commander's voice crackled over the intercom, calm, precise, exactly as they'd drilled 1,000 times in Texas. Fear wanted to take over, but discipline won. The 761st fell back on their training. Commanders issued clear orders. Gunners adjusted for range and wind. Drivers maneuvered around obstacles and through killing zones with practiced efficiency. What looked like chaos from the outside was actually a machine responding exactly as it had been built to respond. They punched through German roadblocks. They knocked out enemy gun positions. When American infantry found themselves pinned down by fire, the rumble of Sherman engines announced the arrival of support. The Black Panthers drove forward, shields of steel between fragile men and German machine guns. Town by town, they advanced. Morville-les-Vic fell. Then the next objective, and the next. Under heavy fire, in conditions that would break lesser units, they took ground and held it. The white infantrymen who had watched them with skepticism days earlier now listened for the sound of those engines with something close to relief. Reports began filtering up through command channels. This battalion is different. They're not just holding their own, they're exceeding expectations. But victory came with a price. Tanks sat smoking in the mud, their crews dead or dying inside. Medics worked frantically. Letters written days earlier would never be read by the men who'd written them. The 761st's success was paid for in blood. Their own blood, shed on foreign soil for a country that still questioned their humanity. By the time the guns fell silent that first week, something fundamental had shifted. The 761st had proven they could fight. But now the question became, how far were they willing to go when the war demanded something beyond courage? When it demanded ruthless resolve? The answer would come from a quiet man named Warren Creasy. Sergeant Warren G.H. Creasy wasn't the kind of soldier who drew attention to himself. Off the battlefield, he was soft-spoken, humble, the kind of man who shared jokes with his crew and wrote regular letters home. He rarely raised his voice. He didn't need to. Respect came naturally to him. Then came the day that changed everything. Creasy's tank was leading a column through a sector thick with enemy positions. Without warning, German anti-tank guns opened fire. The first round punched through his Sherman's armor like paper. Metal screamed. Smoke filled the interior. The tank was done. Most men would have scrambled for cover, grateful to be alive. Creasy pulled himself from the burning wreck and looked around at the chaos unfolding. German infantry was advancing, sensing they'd stopped the American push cold. If they weren't stopped now, the entire position could collapse. He made a decision that defied every survival instinct. Creasy climbed onto an exposed half-track mounting a .50 caliber machine gun. Completely in the open, completely vulnerable. And as enemy fire kicked up dirt around him, he opened up. The gun roared. German infantry advancing across open ground crumpled under the sustained fire. He swung the weapon toward enemy observers calling in artillery. Cut them down. Targeted gun crews trying to reload. Raked their positions until they went silent. Bullets snapped past his head. Shells exploded close enough to shower him with debris. The quiet, mild-mannered sergeant had become something else entirely. A force of nature holding the line through sheer, unrelenting will. His one-man counterattack bought the battalion precious minutes to regroup and respond. Other tanks maneuvered into position. Infantry found cover and returned fire. What could have been a rout became a standoff. Then, a reversal. When the smoke cleared, men who'd served alongside Creasy for months stared at him as if seeing him for the first time. Commanders who witnessed it knew the truth. His actions had likely saved dozens of lives and prevented a catastrophic breakthrough. Among the men of the 761st, Creasy's reputation was transformed overnight. The quiet sergeant who wrote letters home was also one of the most dangerous men on the battlefield when pushed to the edge. But if Creasy showed what one man could do in a moment of crisis, the battalion was about to be tested in a way that demanded something even greater. Not just bravery, not just skill, sacrifice of the highest order. And the man who would embody that sacrifice was already leading from the front, unaware that his next mission would cost him everything. His name was Reuben Rivers. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers was the kind of leader men would follow into hell. He always volunteered for the lead tank, the most dangerous position in any column. His crew respected him not because he was loud or dramatic, but because he combined calm authority with quiet, unshakable courage. In mid-November 1944, Rivers was doing what he always did, leading from the front. His tank rolled through a sector suspected of being mined. Then the world exploded. The blast lifted the 30-ton Sherman off the ground. Inside, chaos. Metal shrieking, men thrown against steel, smoke and screaming. When the dust settled, Rivers' leg was shredded, bone visible through torn flesh and uniform. The medics were clear. He needed immediate evacuation. His commander made it an order, promising him recognition, medals, rest. His war, they insisted, was over. Rivers refused. He rejected morphine that would cloud his judgment. He waved off evacuation. And he climbed into another tank, not out of ego or machismo, but because he believed his platoon needed his experience to survive what was coming. They were green. He wasn't. That simple calculation was all that mattered to him. For 3 days, he led from the front with a leg that barely functioned. The pain was constant, the infection spreading. But his voice over the radio remained calm, steady, professional. Younger soldiers listened to that voice and found courage they didn't know they had, knowing what he was enduring just to stay with them. On November 19th, during a critical push near Gibling, German fire found his tank again. A direct hit. The Sherman erupted in flames. By the time anyone could reach it, Rivers was gone. His last radio transmission still echoing in his comrades' ears, still calm, still focused on the mission. The grief that swept through the 761st was immediate and crushing. But it didn't break them. It transformed them. The sorrow crystallized into something cold and focused. A fury that didn't scream. It calculated. They attacked German positions with a level of determination that stunned even their own officers. They crushed strong points, drove back counterattacks, and refused to yield an inch of ground. Rivers had given everything. They would honor that by finishing what he'd started. Rivers' body would never return to the front lines, but his spirit did. In every tank that refused to back down, in every crew that pushed through exhaustion and fear, in every commander who chose duty over safety. They would carry that spirit into the deadliest winter of the war. The Battle of the Bulge was coming. December 1944. Hitler launched his last desperate gamble, a massive surprise offensive through the snow-covered Ardennes forest. American lines buckled. Units were cut off and surrounded. Chaos rippled through the Allied command as the German assault punched deep into their positions. In the center of that chaos sat Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne and other American units were trapped, running low on ammunition, food, and hope. Patton received orders that seemed impossible. Turn his entire Third Army 90 degrees north in the middle of winter and attack through blizzards to break the encirclement. He needed units that could move fast and hit hard. He called on the Black Panthers. The drive north was hell before they ever saw the enemy. Tanks slid on ice-covered roads. Crews froze in uniforms designed for autumn, not the coldest winter Europe had seen in decades. Engines that were pushed to their limits stalled and had to be coaxed back to life. They fought snow, mud, and bone-deep exhaustion just to reach the battlefield. Then they hit the German flank. The fighting near Bastogne was savage and close. Tank duels at ranges where you could see the faces of enemy crews, infantry engagements where the snow turned black with soot and red with blood. The 761st hammered German positions at critical crossroads, refusing to give ground even as enemy armor tried to overwhelm them. Inside Bastogne, surrounded American forces were down to their last supplies. Every hour that passed brought them closer to collapse. Then they heard it. The rumble of armored relief columns breaking through from the south. Among those columns, black tankers driving Shermans through snow and fire. When the encirclement finally cracked and supplies began flowing in, something remarkable happened. There was no time for prejudice, no room for doubt. White paratroopers who days earlier might have questioned whether black soldiers belonged in combat now greeted the 761st as saviors. Mutual respect was forged in the only crucible that truly burns away prejudice: shared survival. The walls didn't come down everywhere, but here, in the frozen hell of the Ardennes, they cracked. The Black Panthers had proven themselves again, not just as competent, but as essential. They'd fought through cold that froze men solid, through steel that tore tanks apart, through disbelief that should have broken their spirits. But the war wasn't finished asking things of them. Now it would demand something even more symbolic: that they help break the fortress that guarded the very heart of the Reich itself. The Siegfried Line was waiting. The Siegfried Line. Miles of concrete obstacles called Dragon's Teeth, reinforced bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, and artillery positions that had been pre-sighted for years. German troops were told it was impenetrable, the final shield protecting the Reich itself. In early 1945, the 761st was assigned to help break it. They rolled toward those concrete teeth, knowing that mines waited beneath the snow, that ambushes were set in every tree line, that defenders would fight with the desperation of men protecting their homeland. The assault was methodical and brutal. Sherman tanks blasted paths through obstacles while engineers worked under fire. Pillboxes that had seemed invincible fell one by one as the Panthers targeted firing slits and doorways. Infantry poured through the gaps, clearing bunkers in savage close-quarters fighting. Strong point by strong point, the impenetrable line fractured. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone paying attention. Men whose own country still restricted where they could sit on a bus were helping to demolish the defenses of a regime that had built an entire philosophy on racial supremacy. As the 761st pushed deeper into Germany and Austria, German resistance began to crumble. But something else emerged from the chaos, a smell that reached them before they understood what it meant. Sickening, unnatural. The kind of stench that makes hardened soldiers gag. Then they saw it. The concentration camp materialized through the trees like a vision from hell. Skeletal figures in striped uniforms stared at them with hollow eyes. Piles of bodies stacked like cordwood. The infrastructure of industrialized death laid bare in the spring sunlight. Tankers who'd faced panzers without flinching broke down and wept. They shared their rations with survivors who could barely eat. They tried to offer comfort while confronting something that defied comprehension: the logical endpoint of an ideology that had classified entire groups of human beings as less than human. There was an unspoken connection in that moment. Black American soldiers who knew intimately what it meant to be dehumanized, who'd grown up under the shadow of lynching and Jim Crow, now stood face to face with the victims of a different but parallel evil. The wounds were different, but the underlying poison was the same. The belief that some lives matter less than others. The 761st had helped tear down the walls of a dictatorship built on that poison. But as the war in Europe ended and they prepared to return home, they had no idea that another kind of wall still waited for them on their own shores. The ships came home. Uniforms were pressed, medals pinned to chests. Men who had broken through the Siegfried Line and helped liberate concentration camps stepped back onto American soil expecting something. There were no large-scale parades, no nationwide headlines celebrating their victories, no recognition proportional to what they'd accomplished. The color line they'd left behind was still there, unchanged. Many of the same restrictions remained in place: where they could live, where they could eat, where they were allowed to sit. Some veterans faced open hostility when they wore their uniforms in public, as if their service was an insult rather than a sacrifice. The men of the 761st returned to their lives. They found work. They raised families. They gathered in veterans' halls and told their stories to each other, passing them down in living rooms and barbershops instead of history books. For decades, their achievements remained in the shadows, known to those who'd served alongside them, but largely forgotten by the nation they'd fought for. Then, slowly, recognition began to come. Historians started digging. Journalists asked questions. Surviving veterans refused to let the story die. In 1978, more than 30 years after the war ended, the 761st finally received a Presidential Unit Citation. Individual heroes like Reuben Rivers were awarded the Medal of Honor, though Rivers himself had been dead for over 50 years. Let's be clear about what brutal meant when applied to these men. It was never cruelty toward the innocent. It was never savagery for its own sake. It was ruthless precision. Determination that refused to bend, the ability to face an enemy that embraced terror and extermination, and to meet that enemy with professional, disciplined violence until it was defeated. The story of the 761st Tank Battalion became a symbol of both courage and contradiction. They were soldiers who fought with extraordinary bravery for freedoms they did not fully enjoy at home. Their legacy would echo through later generations, influencing the integration of the armed forces, inspiring civil rights activists, and reminding the world that heroism has never been limited by the color of skin. They were the battalion General Patton was once afraid to send to war. When the moment came, they didn't just fight. They helped change the course of a world at war and forced history to reconsider who its heroes really are. The mud of Lorraine, the frozen hell of Bastogne, the concrete teeth of the Siegfried Line, the horror of the camps. The Black Panthers rolled through all of it, and history will never forget. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each story matters. Each story deserves to be remembered, and we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans continents and generations, from veterans to history enthusiasts, from students to scholars. You are part of something meaningful here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories.